Pricing metrics, probably the single most important thing in your SaaS pricing model. Now, there's one misconception with pricing metrics, namely that if they track the value that is being generated with your customer, it's probably a good one. It's sort of true, but there are nuances to this answer that I see people trip up on a lot of times. So I want to go over it, show you a case on it, and explain to you how to do the thinking properly in order to select your value-based pricing metric. Okay, so take a look at this case. This is a customer that I worked with a couple years ago. They're a corporate spin-off doing about $10 million ARR. They do AI and machine learning for banks. So they have a machine learning platform that they can insert into the tech stack of a bank. Then they can take data in, build different kinds of AI models that learn. It could be credit score processing or some sort of capital risk models that the bank wants to run, output it into the business of the bank, and then the bank wins. Okay, it's clear that the platform that runs here generates value on a lot of different dimensions. The client that I worked with had two pricing metrics in place in order to try to capture this value and generate their price. One was the number of users that the bank would put on the platform, so the number of users that had access to the models that could work with the toolbox and so forth. And the other was the number of models in production. So the more models the bank has, the more value they generate, the better they're off, the more they should want to pay. So they had built a matrix out of these two pricing metrics, which meant that if the bank had up to 8 users and maybe had 5 models, they would pay 10,000 euros a month. If the bank had 20 users and 15 models, they would pay 18,700 a month, and so forth. So the first thing that you realize is that both users and models actually correlate very well with the value being generated. So more users equals more value, more models equals more value. So both check off this requirement of being correlated to value, of being part of the value generation process. However, when I ask the client, does the customer actually want more models and want more users? Now the answer changes, because the answer is yes, they want more models. That's why they're buying the platform. They have none, they want some, but they don't want any more users. The response from the banks in the sales process is, well, how many users do we need minimally to actually run the solution? My client would then go into their sales pitch saying, well, more users, more value. And the banks would, in all cases that they had ever sold, say, we will start with 8, because that is the minimum requirement. And the logic is, well, if we can generate value from 8, we'll see, then we can always upgrade to 20 or more. So we can build on this metric as we go along. This was frustrating to my client, who had the insight that the more users, the quicker the banks would adopt the software, the more models they would create, and so forth. So really what we need to do in order to understand what's going on from a commercial perspective and from a psychological perspective with this client and the bank customer is the following. Imagine that you're the bank, that you're the customer, and that you set out to do AI. So what's going to happen is going to happen in a sequence, in a specific order. The first thing you're going to do is you're going to appoint someone head of AI and say, here's a team and here's a budget and here's a mission, go create AI models in the bank. Then that person is going to take his team, he's going to source different business cases, he's going to get all the data integrated in a row. He's going to come up with ideas for models and start to train those. Then those models are going to be deployed into the bank where they improve the business somehow. They have some sort of KPI impact, either the credit scores are better, there's less capital at risk, the lead generation is more precise, whatever it is the bank wants to do with the AI. At each of these steps in the value chain, in the value creation process of the bank, we can measure different things. So at step 1, where we have the team and the budget, we can measure number of users. At step 2, we can measure number of data sources. We could measure number of sketch models that are being worked on. We could measure gigabyte intake and so forth. At the third step, we could measure number of models in production. And at the fourth step, we could measure something like data outputs, like credit scores, for example. The important thing to notice is that there are ends. One end is an input. That is where the customer, the bank, inputs cost, the input budget, they input an investment that then generates a return and output at the end of the value chain, which is where they get their credit scores or whatever it is that they were after. So until we realize this, we can't really grasp that, yes, users are correlated to the value being generated, but they are at the beginning of the chain. They are seen as a cost. They are an input into the value generation process that then becomes value at the end. So models in production are further towards the end of the value chain. They're the outcome that the customer is after, just followed by the actual credit scores or the money being generated or the balance sheet being improved. So what we can do with something like the client that I worked with was to say, well, if the customer looks at their value chain, and I know they don't do this explicitly, but they do it implicitly, is that they say, well, we're going to invest 8 users at the beginning, and then those users are going to create some models, and we'll see what kind of value they generate. And if they then actually work and the ROI is high enough on the use of your solution, we will input 20 users in the next cycle. This cycle, the running of the value chain with your customer, is called the expansion sales cycle. The time it takes from your customer to invest in your product, run a value cycle, and then reinvest is usually the time it takes for them to realize that they want to buy more of your solution. So by constricting the value chain early in the chain process with your pricing, you're minimizing the investment that the customer makes in your solution, which means they adopt slower, they generate less value over time, and so forth. So what you want to do is you want to look at the value chain that your customer has, understand it completely, understand what you can measure, and pick a pricing metric that is more towards the end. So the takeaway here is value chains are like rainbows. The gold is at the end.